Welcome back to Inside Story. We're joined once again from London by Peter Felsted, Chief Editor of Jane's Defence Weekly, and from Washington, D.C., Josh Rushing, our military analyst. Also by Ambassador Oliver Miles, who's spent many years travelling the Middle East, still maintains close contact with many countries out here. Ambassador Miles, if I could refer back to that letter once again that you addressed to the Prime Minister along with 51 other senior ambassadors and members of the diplomatic community, and quote you this passage: "However much Iraqis may yearn for a democratic society, the belief that one could now be created by the coalition is naive." You wrote that 3 years ago. Is it even more pertinent now than it was then?
Yes, I think it's been vindicated by events. There's really nothing in the letter, almost nothing in the letter that I would wish to change. I think we saw quite clearly what was going to happen, and I think we weren't unusual in that. I think that most people with experience of Iraq and the region foresaw what was likely to happen. The curious thing is that some political leaders, both in Washington and in London, failed to see that.
And how many political leaders still believe that it's possible, do you think?
That's a very difficult question to answer. You know, we've just had a change of Prime Minister in Britain. The new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, was, of course, a very senior minister throughout the Blair governments. So he's associated with the British position in Iraq, and he hasn't tried to pretend anything different from that. But whether he is as fully committed to it as Tony Blair, we've yet to see. In Washington, I think that there are signs, aren't there, that I'm not a Washington expert, but in the Senate and House of Representatives, we've seen increasing volume of feeling that the war is misconceived. I've just seen a report by the Global Policy Forum, which is a very prestigious think tank in New York, which is much more radical than any report I've seen on the subject before, I think, calling for the Security Council to terminate the mandate of the coalition, calling for immediate withdrawal of the coalition, calling for clarification of the American position on the bases which they seem to be building to maintain a permanent presence in Iraq, pointing out the damage that's been done by the ghastly stories of Abu Ghraib and come to that, Guantanamo Bay, pointing out what the American attacks by air and ground forces on Iraqi cities have caused in terms of suffering and so on. This isn't just a British problem, you know. The Americans are under pressure as well. Josh
Rushing, I saw you nodding while the ambassador was making that point. Your thoughts on what he had to say, and also, I wonder whether that feeling, that sense of a mission that's heading in entirely the wrong direction is not just being felt by the politicians, but by those now speaking out from within the forces.
Oh, it definitely is. It's interesting. He mentioned Congress turning more and more against this war, and that is true, and you will see that come to a head around September 15th when General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker are due to give their report on the update about the surge to Congress. So a lot of the politics have been held off until that date, when I think you will see a spike in the debate in Congress. But even from within the military's own ranks, just this weekend in the New York Times, there was an op-ed piece written criticizing everything that's going on in Iraq and how the military and the government there are working at odds with one another, how the goals are unattainable. But what was notable about this op-ed piece is it was written by a handful of sergeants and staff sergeants from the 82nd Airborne Division currently stationed in Iraq. That's unprecedented. I can't think of the last time I've seen an op-ed piece at that level come from some of the junior ranking guys within a war zone criticizing the policy. So you're definitely hearing this dissent. But what's interesting just of late is there's a twist on it where they're saying that they are now experiencing some success in Iraq. This is from the military, from Bush, and from conservative bloggers and pundits. That may not be surprising for them to say that there's some success, but they may actually have a few facts to back up their case at this point. So it's adding a bit of a twist, and it will all come to a head about September 15th when Petraeus presents his report.
Peter Felsted, if I could quote you the last sentence of the article that Josh Rushing is talking about here, it says, "We need not talk about morale as committed soldiers. We will see this mission through." But it's interesting that they felt it necessary to write this. What do you think that says about the general atmosphere within inside the forces?
Well, I think you'll see people out in theatre now that have perhaps been there 2 or 3 times before. It's interesting that it's the 82nd Airborne that is mentioned there. I was with the 82nd Airborne in Baghdad in 2003, and at that time it was generally a positive story. That actually cleared most of the schools, almost all of them, of the ordnance that was hidden in them, which was everything from small mortar rounds to surface-to-air missiles. The power was up and running, local government was actually up and running and fully functioning, and it was generally a positive story. Those guys had been contacting local engineers even while they were still fighting. And I think there's been something of the case of the occupier that has actually exacerbated the decline in the mission here, because no country, whatever country it is, wants to be occupied, and the longer the coalition remains, then the worse that factor is going to be.
And what if the emphasis militarily now switches from Iraq to Afghanistan? How difficult are those tired soldiers going to find it in what many people suggest is actually a more difficult theatre of war?
Well, it is difficult. Historically, it's certainly been very difficult, and obviously the Soviet Union found it very difficult. But in military terms, it is a different kind of an operation. It's not necessarily a case of eradicating the Taliban, but it's also what has been described as this ink blot theory, where you create secure areas and you present a different alternative way of living to the people that have formerly been under Taliban rule, and you attempt to make that work. And I think that is more possible. It certainly doesn't involve the kind of built-up fighting that we'd see in Baghdad.
But so many casualties, reports of at least half of the troops there having to have some kind of medical treatment and then being put back onto the front line.
Well, I think both Iraq and Afghanistan have demonstrated the need within the UK and the American militaries for more hardened protected vehicles. Everyone used to criticise the Israelis for using tanks in built-up areas, and yet what are we doing now? We're using heavier and heavier armoured vehicles because of the threat from roadside bombs and explosively formed penetrators. But at least in Afghanistan, it's a different environment, it's a different landscape, and I think there is more that is achievable on a greater scale.
Josh Rushing, do you agree with that?
Well, there's nothing new in war about patching up guys and putting them back on the front lines. That's the same thing the Romans did, the same thing that happened in World War II, the same thing happened in Vietnam. Every war, you're going to have guys get injured, get patched up, and get put back on the front line.
Yeah, but the point, Josh, surely was that the Americans and other coalition forces thought it would be so much easier. This wasn't going to happen.
No, you're absolutely right. Everything that was promised, and the promises came from politicians, not the military, has not come true. You mentioned before the American military feels like they're left in the lurch by the British pulling out. The British are the least of the American military's concerns when it comes to feeling left in the lurch. They feel in the lurch with their own government, the American government, and the government in Baghdad. Everyone's looking to the U.S. military to provide a solution in Iraq, which it can't. It can only provide stability for the Iraqi government to provide a solution, but that's not happening. So they're caught in between the Baghdad government and the Washington government and the goals set there. They're caught in between the society in Iraq, who doesn't want them there anymore, who's growing increasingly hostile about them being there, and the society in America, who doesn't seem to be at war at all. During World War II, 12% of the people in America were in the military. Right now, less than 1% serve in the military. And during this same time, the American people have enjoyed tax cuts. So it doesn't feel like they're at a war at all.
Ambassador Oliver Miles, if I may come to you to wrap this up, looking ahead. If at the moment it's Iraq and then it becomes Afghanistan once again and the emphasis shifts militarily and politically, what are the dangers with that?
Well, I have to be a bit careful here because I don't want to pretend I'm an expert in areas which I know nothing about. I'm not a military man. My impression from the contacts I've had with military people and retired military people in Britain are that the morale of the armed forces is strong. I read that last sentence from the report in the article written by the 7 American non-commissioned officers about how there's no problem about morale in the U.S. Army, and I believe that to be the case in the British Armed Forces as well. But having said that, I've yet to meet a single military man or retired military man who actually believes that the policy we've been following in Iraq is a sensible one. That's the problem. It's not the execution of the policy, it's the fact that the policy isn't going to work and never was going to work.
OK, Ambassador Miles, thank you very much indeed. Peter Felsted from Jane's Defence Weekly, thank you too, and Josh Rushing, as we wrap up this debate on the coalition of the willing, as it was once called, inside Iraq. And as we end, worth, I think, reading to you the very end of the letter that was sent by those servicemen and published in the New York Times this week. It suggests that more power is given to the Iraqis, that the current policy is unworkable. And it ends this way. This suggestion is not meant to be defeatist, but rather to highlight our pursuit of incompatible policies to absurd ends without recognising the incongruities. Thank you for watching Inside Story. We'll see you next time.